a new fantasy factor in Arizona? Or the biggest overspend of the year coming on week 12 waivers? You could make the argument right now either way on Michael Wilson, and there's a case for him carrying value even after Marvin Harrison Jr. returns. Meanwhile, one of our true waiver darlings from last week paid off, but now he just might hurt you if you chase him. Who is that, and what's the risk? Find out in an all-new Draft Sharks podcast right now. Matt Schauf and Jared Smola of DraftSharks.com here to get you ready for your Week 12 waiver wire runs. And Jared, we highlighted handcuff-level running backs on last week's show. Several of those guys did pay off. We've got more of that to cover on this one, but we got to start with Michael Wilson. You and I said on this show last week that Trey McBride was about to get the Jamar Chase treatment. It wasn't him. It was Michael Wilson getting the Jamar Chase treatment in this game. 18 targets, 15 catches, 185 yards. We'll see about Marvin Harrison Jr. this week. Obviously, his absence was a key factor. Another key factor, of course, was Arizona attempting 57 passes in that game against San Francisco, an NFL record 47 completions from Jacoby Brissett. What do we do with Michael Wilson now? Is he somebody worth some attention to you on waivers this week, or did you miss and now you got to let somebody else pay?
Well, you definitely missed the biggest game of Wilson's career. I feel confident saying that. Now, that said, I'd kind of be surprised if Marvin Harrison plays this week. The guy had surgery, 10 days ago or whatever it was. So I think Wilson's going to get another game as the lead back, as the lead wide receiver here. There's just absurd stuff going on in Arizona right now. As you said, Matt, 57 pass attempts from Brissett, NFL record for completions in a game. So that makes Wilson feel a bit flimsy. The Cardinals keep falling behind in these games. They faced a struggling San Francisco defense in that game last week, but there are some things to like going forward. The Cardinals are just going super pass heavy, even outside of game script with Jacoby Brissett. Since Brissett took over in week 6, the Cardinals are 3rd in pass rate, 5th in neutral pass rate, and 2nd in pass rate over expected. So this high pass volume is at least partly by design. Wilson also gets another nice matchup this week against a pass funnel Jags defense, much tougher against the run than the pass. We see teams passing against Jacksonville at one of the highest clips in the NFL. The Cardinals don't need a reason to go pass heavy. I expect a bunch of passes again for Brissett in this game. So if Harrison's out, and we are projecting him out right now, I think Michael Wilson is a top 25 fantasy receiver this week. I do think once Harrison is back, that Wilson goes back to being the 3rd target in this passing game, and someone who's going to be probably someone you don't want to be starting in fantasy. But, we can assess that as we get there. I think if you're in need of a wide receiver this week, that, Wilson, you should have a pretty high priority, a pretty high fab bid on him if you need a wideout.
And if you don't get Michael Wilson, I think Greg Dortch is underrated for this one, because I don't think that – I'm not saying Greg Dortch is going to lead Michael Wilson in targets this or any other week, but I don't think that the split will be as drastic as 18 for Wilson to 6 for Dortch last week. And we saw Dortch produce on that target count. And for all those pass-friendly reasons that you just pointed out for Wilson, I think that makes him – worth picking up by somebody this week. You still don't want to overpay, but he should make it onto somebody's roster this week, because this has been a pass-happy Arizona offense, because at least in part that backfield sucks. So nobody wants to give the ball to Bam Knight when, especially if you're falling behind in games as they have in a couple of recent ones. But even when you're trying to stay competitive, and when Jacoby Brissett is playing fairly well. So we'll talk about Jacoby Brissett more in a little bit, but I think this whole situation here makes Michael Wilson potentially usable beyond this week. Certainly not going to be anywhere near what he gave us last week, most likely, but maybe like a wide receiver 4 level contributor.
Yeah, I can see that. The Cardinals also just lost Amari DiMercado to a high ankle sprain. We'll see when Trey Benson's back, and what that's going to mean for the pass rate. Benson doesn't seem particularly close to a return, though, has not got back to practice yet. So it'd be surprising to me at this point if he's ready for week 12. So again, I think it's kind of all systems go for Wilson, at least for week 12.
And for what it's worth, we haven't seen all that much of Trey Benson. He's probably easily the best running back once he gets back on the field, but we don't know if he's good enough that he's going to shift the game planning that much. So we'll see on that front. We'll also see if Kyler Murray has a starting job when he is ready health-wise to return to the field. There's another Wilson that we got to talk about, and he's got a bit of a contingency that we're waiting on this week. But Emanuel Wilson, backup running back for the Packers, looks like he might be a starter for 1 week. What's the latest on Josh Jacobs' knee situation, though?
Yeah, no details on the injury other than there's no structural damage and Jacobs is not going to need surgery. So this doesn't sound like a serious injury. We had NFL Network call Jacobs day to day. ESPN's Rob Domofsky called him week to week. Now I don't know, where these guys are getting these labels or whatever, but at this point we're assuming Jacobs is going to miss at least one game. It probably won't be much beyond that. So I don't think Wilson is this, league winner for the rest of the season, but I definitely think he can be helpful in week 12. The Packers are home for Minnesota this week. They're 6.5-point favorites in that game. So it's not a great matchup. The Vikings are 10th in adjusted points allowed to running backs, but just the fact that Green Bay is at home as a favorite, they should be able to run the ball plenty here. And I think Wilson's going to get the vast majority of the backfield work. After Jacobs left last week, Emanuel Wilson played 94% of the Packers' offensive snaps and got all 11 of the running back carries. We're going to see Chris Brooks mix in a bit more this week if Jacobs is out, but everything we've seen all season, really, Wilson's been ahead of Chris Brooks all season. Leads me to believe that Wilson's going to get, 75 to 80% of this backfield work. And I think that's enough to make him not exciting, but like a low end RB2 if you're in need this week.
And that Minnesota defense we thought coming into the season was going to be good. It's to the point now where it's a neutral to potentially positive matchup for the opposing offense. So a fine spot for Wilson. Make sure if you pursue him on waivers this week, you don't do so counting on Josh Jacobs missing this week, because that's not a guarantee yet. We've seen Josh Jacobs play through minor-ish injuries in the past. So I would lean toward expecting him to not play this week. But, don't pay for Emanuel Wilson as though he's definitely a starter for you. And on the other side of that, even if Josh Jacobs makes it back this week, or if it's next week, the knee situation at least increases the chances of some kind of aggravation that causes further missed time. So even if by, Wednesday night, when your waivers run, we're looking at Josh Jacobs sounding like he's trending toward playing, I still think Emanuel Wilson's going to be worth a pickup along the lines of some of these other handcuff level running backs we've talked about in the past couple of weeks.
Yep, good handcuff. And of course, I would say to, just keep an eye on shark bites, because we'll update Jacob's status as well as we can, leading up to your waiver runs, whether that's Tuesday night or Wednesday night.
If you're watching Shark Bites today, as we record this on Tuesday, you got an update already on the Pittsburgh backfield, which could affect whether we go after Kenneth Gainwell on waivers this week. Jared, what's the latest on Jaylen Warren's injury situation?
Yeah, Mike Tomlin said Tuesday morning that he's optimistic Warren will be able to play this weekend. It sounds like it's a low ankle sprain for Jaylen Warren, not the high ankle sprain, which probably would have cost him multiple weeks. So it sounds like he has a chance to play this week. He even last week returned for one snap after going down. Obviously, the ankle didn't feel well enough, and Warren did not play the rest of that game. So the fact that he returned tells us, it's not a super serious injury. So that obviously takes some of the shine off Kenneth Gainwell as a waiver ad this week. I will say, though, in the first half of last week's game, even before Warren went down, it was 8 carries and 1 target for Warren to 6 carries and 3 targets to Kenneth Gainwell. So as Arthur Smith does to us all the time, for whatever reason in this game, they wanted to make Kenneth Gainwell a bigger part of the backfield. So this remains a tough backfield to peg on a weekly basis, but they get the Bears this week. That's a plus matchup for running backs. Even if Warren plays, it's fair to assume he's not going to be at 100%. So that could give Art Smith a push to keep Gainwell involved here. So I think for me, if Warren sits, Gainwell is like a borderline RB1. We saw him have that massive game against the Vikings in Europe when Warren missed a game earlier this season. Even if Warren plays, I think the matchup and the ankle would put Gainwell in the running back 3 flex mix. He's another guy too, like Emanuel Wilson, should just be owned at this point, because if Warren does miss time, again, Kenneth Gainwell becomes a top 15 fantasy running back if Warren's out.
Yeah, to me, this is an even more attractive spot than Emanuel Wilson, because you can play Gainwell even with Jaylen Warren healthy. It's just an offense where he might get enough touches and might get high value touches, and you can steal some fantasy points even if he's not the lead back. So he should be on a roster somewhere. If he's not already, probably is in lots of cases, because he had that bigger game earlier this season. Certainly at least a handcuff level play. And I mean, we'll see where this goes with the Pittsburgh running backs. We talked about Sean Tucker on last week's show, and neither of us would have projected a third of what he gave us fantasy-wise in that game against Buffalo. That said, the fact that he gave us a fantasy viable game of any sort is why we were talking him up last week, because the case for Sean Tucker was he was getting more work, he was getting more involved in a backfield where he was sharing with Rachaad White, who we already knew was a limited player, and they were on the verge of a matchup with Buffalo that's exploitable for running backs. Now, again, nobody was like, watch out, here come multiple Sean Tucker touchdowns. But that's why you take a shot on a guy, and especially why you go ahead and get a guy like Sean Tucker on the cheap before anything big happens, right?
Yeah, that's right. Now, I do think you got to be careful with Tucker going forward at this point. I mean, for starters, we got to see about Bucky Irving. He returned to practice last week. It sounds like he still hasn't been, cleared for full contact with that shoulder injury, but he's getting closer. And despite this massive game from Tucker and really impressive game from Tucker, and it wasn't just the Bills' run defense, which is admittedly and remains bad. Tucker looked awesome in this game, and that's 2 games now as a pro where he's looked awesome when he's been given a big opportunity. So I think he deserves more work. I'm not convinced he's going to get it, though. Last year he has the big week 6. He did not reach 10 opportunities in a game the rest of the way last season. So I don't have faith that Tampa's coaching staff is going to switch up the plan and you give Tucker a big role when Bucky Irving is back, but we'll see about that. If Irving remains out this week, Tucker's in play. The matchup is much tougher though. He gets the Rams, who are first in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. The Bucks are also 6.5-point underdogs in that game, so it's a much tougher spot for Sean Tucker if Irving's out. I think he's an RB3 flex play, but I wouldn't go too aggressive on the waiver wire for him this week. To me, I prefer Emanuel Wilson and Kenneth Gainwell because I think they're better plays this week. And then even longer term, I think all these guys are just handcuffs where you do need either Irving to remain out or, Warren or Jacobs to miss time for any of these guys to be, really comfortable fantasy starters.
If we were handing out senior superlatives for our yearbook this week to these guys, Jared, I would vote Sean Tucker most likely to be bought for way too much on waivers this week. Like I said, we talked him up and the matchup was part of it. And that's a very important part of it because it was like, if you need a running back this week, toss Sean Tucker in this matchup. Obviously it worked out. But as you mentioned, we saw a game like this last year and specifically 17 touches in that game, 192 total yards, 2 touchdowns at New Orleans last season. And like you said, not only did he not get 10 opportunities again in a game that year, Sean Tucker didn't get 10 touches in a game again until week 8 of this season. And that not only followed him showing out a bit in the middle of last year, but also this summer, his coach is saying, hey, we also like Sean Tucker. We're going to involve him, liars. So he's probably usable to some much lower degree whenever Bucky Irving is out going forward. Maybe Sean Tucker could push Rachaad White aside in a backfield that does include Bucky Irving. Probably should, based on the limited production and worth that we've seen from Rachaad White overall. But the absolute upside, the ceiling on Sean Tucker going forward, I think, is probably Tyler Algier, which with an even shakier touch outlook.
Yeah, it's probably fair. I will say, again, if Irving's out this week, a mark in Tucker's favor is that he owned that backfield in the second half of last week's game. Both Tucker and White had 9 carries in the first half. In the second half, it was 10 carries for Tucker to just 1 for Rachaad White. And both guys saw 2 targets. We unfortunately don't have access to what the routes were in just the second half of that game. But both these guys saw 2 targets. Both of Tucker's catches came on designed wheel routes out of the backfield, including the one that went for a 28-yard touchdown. And this is a guy that did some pass catching in college as well. So Rachaad White's probably a better pass catcher still, and I assume he's going to remain the primary pass catcher in Week 12 against the Rams. But I at least think at this point we can project Tucker to not be a total 0 in the passing game. So again, that does help Tucker's viability if Irving remains out this week. If we get Bucky Irving back, I just don't think you can start Sean Tucker.
Yeah, let's just cross our fingers and hope that coaches did the thing like where you eat a food that you haven't had in a long time, and you're like, man, I forgot how much I like this. Let's hope that Bucs coaches gave him that work in the second half because they watched Sean Tucker in the first half and they were like, man, I forgot that Sean Tucker was this good at football.
He's very good. I hope he gets an opportunity, whether it's in Tampa or elsewhere, further down the line now.
Going to be interesting either way. Within the NFC South, the Falcons are in much worse shape than Sean Tucker or his touch outlook. Michael Penix Jr., of course, suffered a knee injury, aggravated a knee injury last week. He's out at least 4 games, and it's probably not going to make much sense for the team to bring him back after that 4-game span, especially when you look at the history of knee injuries for Penix that dates back through college. That means Kirk Cousins at quarterback the rest of the way. The Falcons also expect to miss Drake London for at least 1 game. Jared, what are we doing here? Is there anything to actually like? And then I guess beyond that, even if we don't like it, what do we hold our nose and pick up off waivers this week?
I mean, if you can help it, the Falcons are just a big no thanks for me. I'd rather just not mess with this offense. Just this week, they're implied for 18.5 points against the Saints. They're a 1.5 underdogs to the Saints this week. So little confidence in this Kirk Cousins led offense, and there shouldn't be confidence in it. We saw Cousins play Miami earlier this season, 173 scoreless yards in that game for Cousins against a pass defense that's still bad. The run defense has been better lately for Miami. The pass defense is still bad. And then last week, Cousins replaces Michael Penix and goes 6 of 14 for 48 yards. So I think this entire passing game is going to struggle the rest of the way, even more than it was with Penix, who admittedly has not been great this season. But I do think Cousins is a pretty significant downgrade. Darnell Mooney deserves to be rostered in most leagues at this point. He is going to be Atlanta's number one receiver for however long London's out. And London, by the way, has the same injury that Brock Bowers and Ricky Pearsall have had this season. Both those guys missed multiple games and frankly, didn't look right when they first came back. Ricky Pearsall did absolutely nothing last week in his return. So I think London could miss multiple games and maybe just not be the same player all season. So Mooney's worth a look, but Darnell Mooney's just been horrible this year as well. He had that. We had this exact situation in that Dolphins game. No Michael Penix, no Drake London. So you had Kirk Cousins under center. Mooney as the number one receiver. Mooney caught 1 of 4 targets for 11 yards in that game. So pick him up. Ideally, you're not starting him. Maybe if you see signs of life in this game, you can consider starting Mooney. Further along this year.
Yeah, if you need him, an option, but certainly not somebody you should go chasing after. And I cannot wait to not watch a Tyler Shuck, Kirk Cousins showdown this week.
I'm a lot more excited about Shuck than Cousins, I'll say that.
Wow. We'll leave that for another time. Maybe I'll ask you for the why on Thursday. But for now, anybody else on waivers that's worth targeting before we get to the defenses?
Jacoby Brissett needs to be rostered at this point, right? Like, he's still way under-owned in fantasy leagues. He sat inside our top 12 quarterbacks last week. He's well inside our top 12 quarterbacks this week. Again, there's some flukiness to the pass volume he's getting, but I think you're still going to get nice pass volume from Jacoby Brissett, and he's in a nice matchup this week. So he's the quarterback streamer of the week for sure.
Jared, how long does he have to get that pass volume for before you stop calling it fluky?
Well, 57 pass attempts. I'll call that fluky for the rest of my life.
Yeah, that number does help him rank just behind Joe Flacco for second in the league in pass attempts per game since taking over in week 6. And I mean by 0.2 of a pass attempt. So it's been a high volume pass offense. That's certainly helping. He does have some rushing upside. That's up and down game to game. But as you mentioned, 23% rostered on Sleeper is absurd for a guy who's posted 5 straight top 12 weeks. The next 2, we've got Jacksonville and Tampa Bay. That's what is left before Kyler Murray is eligible to come off of IR. We'll see what happens at that point, but whether Murray's back or not, after those 2 games, the Rams and the Texans. So we've got 2 more weeks of Jacoby Brissett looking like Cinderella, and then we can spend the rest of the season trying to find him to see if the slipper fits.
Exactly.
Week 12 streaming defense. Let me start here with a cautionary tale, Jared. I picked up the Falcons last week in my FFPC main event league to start over Cleveland in my lineup. I did so. Falcons against the Panthers, Browns against the Ravens. Made sense. Cleveland outscored Atlanta, of course, by 15 fantasy points. I lost my matchup by 13. It's a mistake I will make again at some points because I'm not sure it's the wrong play as opposed to a sensible play that didn't work out. But I think the takeaway is sometimes we can overrate the matchups versus the ability of the defense when we're making one-to-one decisions here.
My takeaway there is more not that you overrated the matchup. It's just that football is fluky and defensive performance is even more flukier on top of that, right? Like I would make the decision you made again and again. And I still think if you played out last week 100 times that Atlanta's defense would be better than Cleveland's most weeks. That Bryce Young performance was one of the most surprising performances by any player in any game all season, I think.
So all that said, who are we looking to overrate on defense this week?
I like the Raiders as the best streaming D this week. I think Dylan Gabriel and Shedeur Sanders are both bad in their own special ways. I think Shedeur Sanders is bad in a way that's better for opposing defenses. I think he's going to take more sacks than Gabriel was. He's probably a better interception bet than Gabriel was. The Browns are implied for just 16.5 points in this game. The Raiders defense is not bad. It's not a great defense, but it's not a bad defense either. I think they're plenty good enough, Max Crosby alone to take advantage of this really great spot against Shedeur in what is likely going to be his first start.
Yeah, I think we all just look at the Raiders and we're like, oh, they're playing the Raiders this week, but they're decent. They're down from 11th to 14th in DVOA after that Dallas game, but that's still above the middle of the league, 15th against both the pass and the run. So a decent defense. And really, if you just tell me Max Crosby against Shedeur Sanders, I'm in. I think that's the top streaming defense this week. Week 13, the 49ers get that Cleveland matchup. They have a bit less going for them on defense, a lot less actually going for them on defense than the Raiders do. But the Browns are adding 110% to defense scoring according to our adjusted fantasy points allowed right now. So playing anybody against Cleveland is a solid idea. I also, though, like Jacksonville for next week. They're only 26% rostered on Sleeper right now, 21% on Yahoo. So highly available. Of course, none of us was expecting the performance that they had against the Chargers last week. That's probably going to mean a lot more teams going after them. Maybe not as many go after them this week because they're at Arizona, who of course is coming off the big yardage production and point production that we talked about earlier. But next week, Jacksonville is at Tennessee. So I think the Jags are boom bust this week at Arizona. I think they're all boom next week at Tennessee.
Yeah, top 5 defense for week 13, maybe even top 3. I like Jacksonville for this week too. And we talk about this all the time. I like my defenses just facing dropbacks because that's sack opportunities, that's interception opportunities. I think the Jags this week project to face more dropbacks than any other team and any other defense. We talked about how pass heavy the Cardinals have gone. And Jacoby Brissett, in his 5 starts, he's averaging 3.6 sacks taken per start, and he has 6 giveaways in those 5 starts, 3 interceptions and 3 fumbles. So despite the big counting stats for the Cardinals passing game, Brissett's been a pretty giving quarterback for opposing Ds.
Yeah, I think I like the Raiders better than the Jags this week, but I think Jacksonville is playable. And I think that Arizona is... It's not an offense that I'm specifically targeting the way we talk about targeting Cleveland or Tennessee. But if you're like, man, who should I pick up for a streaming defense this week? I think it's a good one to be like, I'll take the one that's playing against Arizona because they are a one-dimensional offense, as we talked about. They're dropping back because it's all they can do. That makes them sack vulnerable, as you just pointed out, and turnovers are unpredictable. So we don't want to just look at teams that are turning the ball over the most and go after them, or look at teams that haven't happened to turn it over lately and say, that's not a good matchup. Get one that is facing a vulnerable offense that gets those sacks, that at least has some potential to turn the ball over. That's going to be the Bucs in week 13 if you don't have the Jaguars or San Francisco available. And we'll see. Maybe even the Bucs sit ahead of the 49ers in our week 13 ranks. Kind of doubt it with that Cleveland matchup, though.
Yeah, no, and you're obviously not going to mind use the Bucs this week against the Rams, but they are the defense to stash if you can afford to stash 2 Ds right now, because from week 13 on, the Bucs have the easiest remaining schedule for defenses. It's Arizona in week 13, and then it's New Orleans, Atlanta, Carolina, Miami. I think you could start the Bucs all 5 of those weeks and have probably a top 10 defense in our ranking. So that's the defense to stash for the stretch run is the Bucs.
Yeah, make your move right now to get the D, as Nicki Minaj would probably say. You can find more streaming defenses on draftsharks.com right now. We've got a whole article about it, along with the full rankings to show you how we actually order those options for their week 12 matchups. Your free agent finder is set to help you find the best option at any position for your specific league and roster situation this week or next week. And you can find links to whatever you need for your planning in week 12 and beyond in the show notes below. All that is what makes Draft Sharks your unfair advantage.